We are excited to have Dr. Chris McDonald with us today. Chris is the Inland and Desert Natural Resources Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in San Bernardino, Riverside, Imperial, and San Diego counties. His expertise is in managing plants in wildlands with an emphasis on managing difficult weeds. Thank you for joining us, Chris, and you can share your slides.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction, Lindsay. All right, as we talked about, I'm going to be talking about weeds, wildlands, and wildfires, and they are all connected today, and not because they're all connected by the letter W, which makes a wonderful alliteration. It's a more deep connection than just the alphabet. So I'm going to start today with this kind of general idea about our landscapes and whether our landscapes are wild areas, like in the picture on the left, or there's something that's more managed, like in our yards or public spaces. We want these landscapes to look good, to support nature, and to be useful. I think those are the three main jobs of what a landscape does, if a landscape could have a job. But from our perspective, we want them to look good, support nature, and be useful. And depending on what type of a landscape you have, might depend on what emphasis you have. So if you were on a farm, you might want that landscape to be useful because tomatoes are delicious. And if you were in a yard setting, then you want it to look good. And if you're out in the wild, you might want to support nature more than being useful. And these three concepts can be applied to many different types of landscapes. Whether you're on a picture on the right here, we have a wildflower parkway garden just on the side of a road, which is also on the side of a walking trail as well. So in a very urban area with lots of different activities happening, and it still fulfills this looking good and being useful and supporting nature idea. Or if we look at the garden on the left here, we can see that again on this pathway, it's looking good, supporting nature, and is useful. It still functions as a pathway. We can see the path going through here on the mulch. And so when we look at weeds, weed populations reduce all three of these functions in different ways. The landscape on the left does not look as good as it could. It has large invasive annual grasses on it, which are getting mowed down because they're also a fire risk, and I'll talk about that more later, and it doesn't support nature. Picture on the right, we have Bermuda grass growing over through mulch and over onto a sidewalk. It doesn't look good, it's not being useful, and it's not supporting nature. So just two quick examples of how weeds reduce these three primary functions on our landscapes, whatever those landscapes are. One of the problems with weeds is that they're often the last thing that we're worrying about in our landscape, especially when they're small. When weeds are small, we tend to kind of ignore them because it's just something that we don't think is ever going to get to be a big problem. And then when it does become a big problem, it can be expensive and time consuming to fix. Usually when we have a landscape, the bigger concerns are often the function of that landscape. Is it functioning properly? Are there insect pests around? Are there any diseases of those plants that are out there or trees? Is irrigation working properly? Or trails maintenance, things like that. We're generally not thinking about weeds as a problem on our landscape until it's often difficult to remove them. So the question is, why do we have these weeds, which can be on the landscape, and then they become problematic? Essentially, why are weeds weedy? So this is the rest of this talk is mostly answering this why type of a question. I'm not going to answering the how do we get to control weeds. I'm answering the question today of why weeds are weedy and how that connects to wildlife and wildfires. Again, lots of W's today. I think to summarize this up, why do some plants spread in our yards and our landscapes and others just kind of stay where we want them? So there's a picture here where we have broccoli at the end of the blue arrow growing in a garden bed, and you can see the broccoli is just being completely overrun by weeds. Question is why? Why is that broccoli doing just fine, or not just fine by itself? Why is the broccoli not spreading like a weed, but the weeds are spreading like a weed? What's going on here? So to answer this question, I need to go on several tangents, and I like going on tangents. So we're going to go on some tangents, and we're going to start at the beginning of the baseline of our knowledge of what jobs does a plant do? Or another way to put this question is, why does a plant look like a plant? So we've got this chocolate lily here, and you can see that has these kind of long strap-shaped leaves on the bottom. They're growing out and around in a rosette. So they're doing something. These leaves are obviously growing in a somewhat, a particular way to do something. And as you're thinking about this, I'll throw out a hint in there. And then one of the main principles in biology is that form follows function. And what that basically means is that the way something looks is related to the job that it has. And I think we all know this. We all took, high school, middle school, elementary biology. And we know that leaves have this very important job of catching sunlight. And they're doing that by basically acting like a solar panel. And so leaves are biological solar panels that photosynthesize and turn light and air into sugar, and then they can grow. So the basic job of a plant here is to catch light, and then the roots have to absorb water. So the plants are absorbing water, and they have to do that by occupying some sort of space below ground and above ground, because you need space for those leaves to grow, and you need space for those roots to grow. And then at the end of the day, they need to eventually reproduce. They need to make babies. If those plants are not making seeds, then they are not going to survive very long. So those are the basic jobs of being a plant. So adding on to this, in the last slide, I showed you that what that one individual plant is doing as its job. But there are very few plants that are growing all alone in this kind of cartoony environment where the sun's shining down from above and there's no neighbors around and everything is all hunky-dory. The world is not working like that, especially for plants. Most plants have some sort of neighbor around. So here on the left, I've got a picture of an oak tree, and it's got a beautiful long tall stem, but you can see there's another oak tree coming out from the right side of this picture and moving over, crowding into the canopy of this oak tree in the middle of the picture. So even though it looks like there's one oak tree in this picture, there's actually two. So these two oak trees are competing for that same resource, sunlight, to try and catch as much sunlight as possible, grow babies. In the case of oaks, oak babies are acorns, make acorns and reproduce. Or you can see here in this cutaway of the soil, you see all of these grasses that have been sown, and you can see all of the roots are growing towards each other. And these roots are, even though these are seedlings, these roots are starting to compete with each other underground. So these plants are trying to gain some sort of advantage against their neighbor while they're competing for space. And that space might be below the soil surface, on the soil surface, or up in the canopy. But again, these plants are competing against each other. So this kind of adds a nuance to the basic jobs or the basic principles of being a plant. So if we kind of put these last two slides together, that the jobs of being a plant, or a principle of being a plant, is that plants are trying to catch sunlight, they're absorbing water, and they're surviving against their competitive neighbors to eventually reproduce and make more babies. Plants are really smart, even though they don't have brains. They've figured out hundreds of thousands of different ways of succeeding at this basic task of making babies. Worldwide, there are just under 400,000 plant species that have been described, and about 2,000 newly described plant species, or about 2,000 plant species are newly described each year. So the number of plants that we know of is growing each and every year, including in California, where a handful of new plant species are described every year. So I talked about the W's and weeds, wildlife, and wildlands, wildfires. So what does this principle of being a plant and growing and competing and making seeds have to do with weeds, and it has everything to do with weeds because all plants, regardless of whether they're in our landscapes or whether they're in the desert or whether they're in a grassland, are competing against each other, and they have to win against their neighbors at some point to be able to survive today. Those plant species that were weak competitors hundreds of thousands and millions of years ago are no longer here anymore. We only have the plants that can do their job at growing in the environment successfully today. And this happens in every environment in California, regardless of whether it's really, really dry or really, really wet. These plants are all competing against each other in some way, shape, or form. And so there's entire textbooks on this plant competition that I'm narrowing down here into just a few slides. But it's really, really important for plants, partly because plant species are competing at different intensities. So if we think about this, it kind of makes sense. There's some plants in your yard that are really competitive and they spread really, really well. And there's other plants in your yard that kind of stay put and don't really go anywhere, but they might, produce a couple of new seeds each year, and you might get one or two new individuals. So if you kind of put this together, there's this competition hierarchy among plants where you have the most aggressive and the most invasive plants are near the top of this hierarchy. And the weeds are in second place, where they're not as aggressive as these invasive plants. But then these native plants, crops, garden plants are often closer to the bottom of the hierarchy. They just aren't as competitive. And for plants, competition is real and it's deadly serious, because once a plant germinates and grows in the soil, it's locked into living in that place for the rest of its life. And so whatever neighbors are around or come along, those are its competitors. Plants can't move. And I know that we all know that. But the point here is, for many animal species, they can avoid competition by just walking or flying away. Plants can't do that. Once a competitive neighbor comes by and roots next to them, they're stuck with that neighbor for the rest of their life or your life. So it's a different kind of competition when you're stuck together in the same soil or in the same pot. But I still really haven't got to the answer here of why are weeds weedy. I've basically gotten to this kind of half answer of because some plants are good competitors. But that doesn't really get to the root issue of why are these weeds good competitors? Why aren't the native plants good competitors? Why aren't our garden plants good competitors? So to answer this question, I'm going to show this really interesting picture, and it's a little gross for those of you who don't like insects, so sorry that I'm showing this before lunch right now. But one of the reasons why weeds are weedy is that when they get moved to a new area, I'm going to call that the invaded range, those weeds lose something that controls their population. Oftentimes this is a predator. So in this picture down here, these larvae are actually seed-eating weevil larvae that are in a flower of a thistle. And so as these larvae grow, they root around inside the flower and they eat the really nutritious seeds. And so oftentimes when a weed is brought to a new area, just the seeds are brought to the new area and not the predators and pathogens and diseases or other things that keep its population in check in the home range. So when this thistle moves to California and it doesn't have these seed-eating weevils, more seeds can survive and it can thrive, whereas the native plants have those native predators and pathogens that are partially controlling their population, and this non-native thistle doesn't, and it is able to spread and thrive when it's moved to a new area like California. Another reason why weeds are weedy is that some plants from other parts of the world just grow in a different way that our native plants in California don't. So I've got a picture here on the right of black mustard. It is the tall growing yellow flowers that's kind of in the background. And this plant under good growing conditions can grow to be 10 feet tall. And it's an annual plant. And wild oats, the green stuff that's growing in the foreground here, is oftentimes can grow to be 3 to 5 feet tall as well. Many of our native wildflowers in California top out at about 2 to 3 feet. So all of those native species that just don't grow much taller than 3 feet are going to get crowded out, overshaded by black mustard and wild oats, because black mustard and wild oats grow really tall, and they were accidentally transported to Southern California. And so they're growing in a new way that the native plants just cannot compete against. They can't tolerate it. There's other ways. I'm just giving an example here of, of growing taller, but they can grow faster. They could grow earlier. They could germinate quicker. They can grow bigger leaves or deeper roots, or they complete their life cycle sooner. So if the native plants need 100 days to go from seed to flower, and the weeds only need 60 days to go from seed to flower, those weeds can survive a drought better than the native plants can. There's just lots of different reasons, but the main goal here is that they grow in a different way that the native plants can't or don't. Another reason why weeds are weedy is because weeds can grow in the conditions in the new environment better than the natives do. So maybe in their home area, they have a lot of fires, or maybe they grow in a flood-prone area, or maybe they can tolerate soil disturbance well. So when you bring those, in the case of Southern California and most of California, those European grasses into Southern California grasslands, those European grasses do a better job at growing after a fire or growing after livestock grazing than many of our native wildflowers and grasses do. So they're playing the game of being a plant in the real world better than our native plants can. So a good analogy for this is to think of two sports that are called football. So we have American football on the left, and we have European football on the right, or soccer. And so this idea of, doing better in a different environment. So if we imagine we put so both of these sports are very similar. They both have 11 players on the field at a time. Their fields are roughly approximately the same size. They both have football in the name, even though one is football and one is hand football. But if you put a football team against a soccer team, depending on the rules of the game will depend on who wins. So if the football players are wearing their pads and wearing their helmets, they can easily clobber a soccer team. Hands down, football players are going to win. But if the football players can't wear their helmets and can't wear their pads, and there's no timeouts, like in soccer where you run for 90 minutes more or less straight, the football players are going to get completely gassed out, and the soccer players are going to run circles around the football players. So this is kind of the same thing, where when those European grasses get introduced to California grasslands or European thistles or whatever the weed is, introduced into that new environment, depending on the rules of the game, sometimes those weedy species win because they do a really good job at following that certain set of rules. Just like in this example, the football players might win under certain circumstances, or the soccer players might win under circumstances, depending on how we mash up these two sports. Another reason why weeds are weedy is really simple. You just make more babies. If the weeds can reproduce more than the natives, you're making more individuals the next year. So here's an example of stinknet. It's a little yellow plant from South Africa in the sunflower family. It's spreading in Southern California. It makes a ton of seeds. Each one of these flowers can produce over 100 seeds. You look at this population in the picture on the right, and you can see that there's just hundreds of thousands of flowers. And now we're talking about millions of seeds just in this small little patch. If you can out-reproduce your neighbors, you will win the game of competition eventually. There are a few other factors that cause weeds to be weedy. I don't need to get into all of them. Those were the big ones, but there are others out there. And there's also many exceptions to these rules that I've provided. Sometimes slow-growing perennials like pine trees can be invasive, which are invasive in Chile and New Zealand. And eucalyptus, which is from Australia, is also invasive in California. So sometimes these rules kind of get have exceptions to them. But in summary, why are weeds weedy? Because they're more competitive. And why are they more competitive? Because they lost something that holds their population in check, like a predator, or they can grow differently, or they tolerate disturbances, or they make lots of seeds. And in many cases, these reasons are not mutually exclusive. They overlap. So you can have a weed that makes lots of seeds and grows taller, or you can have a weed that survives fire and grows deeper roots and grows larger weeds. So you start putting these things and combining them and stacking them together, and you can get some really aggressive weeds out there. So I've been talking a lot about weeds, and I have yet to actually define what a weed is. And I think we have a little bit of time here. So in the chat box is disabled. So use the question and answer box and really quickly just put in there what you think a weed is. Go ahead, it's okay, I'll give you permission. And Lindsay, after a minute or two here, once start people adding some stuff, can you read it off for me?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll give people a minute.
Or just give me a summary of the general ideas of what is a weed? What is a weed? How do you define a weed?
All right, the answers are coming in. I'm seeing a lot of unwanted plants, a plant I don't want, plants that cause harm, wrong plant in the right place, or vice versa. Volunteer plants in places they're not welcome. It's kind of the same. Anything you do not want in your garden.
Anything you do not want, including your neighbor's children.
Maybe.
They're human-shaped weeds.
I'm seeing generally invasive.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I think that about covers the responses. Thanks everyone for putting your input in here.
okay, wonderful. We're all getting to the same idea here. That weed is, and several of you said this, a weed is a plant growing out of place. They're competing against other plants that we want. Some people kind of said they're invasive, they're growing wild, or they're growing out of control. And I think we're all on this similar idea here that they're generally unwanted or undesired, and there's this negative connotation to having weeds. And I do need to point out that there are a few outliers to this kind of weed definition. The most notable and maybe notorious of this is Ralph Waldo Emerson's definition of a weed. A weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. And this gets me. And on top of that, there's plenty of sites on the internet that if you look for weed resources that are outside of the UCIPM website, they'll talk about the benefits of weeds in your yard or in your garden, or how to love weeds, or weeds as part of the ecosystem. And they talk about weeds as being, less and less of a problem. They're almost beneficial in some cases. And while there is a small amount of truth to this kind of weeds can be good idea, or the benefits of weeds, like for example, some pollinators can visit weed flowers, and there are some animals that can use weed seeds as food, or they'll eat the roots of weeds. And there are some weeds that just aren't that problematic. They show up in your garden and they don't really spread too much. They don't do much, but they're around. Or they're around when you have too much irrigation. So if you turn back the sprinklers, then you get less weeds. But based on the weight of the evidence and the numerous studies that have been conducted on weeds, they're wrong. Weeds cause problems, which is why you all came up with these negative connotations about weeds. Weeds have negative effects on most, if not a large majority, of plants, wildlife, or the environment that they are in and around. So in general, our standard dictionary definition of a weed, not the internet bloggy website definition of a weed, is a pretty good definition for what myself as a plant ecologist uses as a weed. It's an unwanted or undesired plant. And there's this negative connotation to this. It is unwanted. No one has ever said, oh, such a good little weed. If you've ever seen Little Shop of Horrors, that type of thinking really got Rick Moranis in trouble with his little weed there. So this definition is based on goals and is subjective. So one person could want this plant and it's not a weed. Another person could not want this plant and it is a weed. Two different people, two different outcomes for the same plant species. And on top of that, this definition doesn't really get into whether a weed is native or non-native. It basically ignores that issue. So there are native weeds and there are non-native weeds. But then we get to the next level here, and are weeds invasive? And invasive plants are the really bad, and colloquially speaking here, invasive plants are the really bad non-native plants that are spreading out of control. Those invasives are the best competitors in the worst type of way. They are doing a really good job at competing and harming everything else. So in plant ecology literature or science, we usually define an invasive plant as one that has been transported to a new region. So it is non-native and it's surviving, establishing, reproducing, and dispersing in that new environment. So it's starting to spread, or it has spread for hundreds of years. Defined in policy terms, invasive plants or non-native plants, again, they have to be exotic. They have not evolved in the area where they're currently found. They were transported there. And they're causing some sort of harm, be it economic, environmental, or it harms human health. And again, these two definitions, while they sound kind of different, they're not, because once you start to spread and you're spreading out of control, you are most likely harming something in the economy, in the environment, or you might harm human health. So again, once you get to this kind of out of control level of competition where you're spreading, you are an invasive plant and you're causing some sort of damage in the environment. So that's the difference between being a weed and being invasive. Invasive are those really bad weedy plants that are spreading out of control and they're non-native, whereas the weedy plants are the unwanted, undesired plants. And so this growing out of control applies to basically as far as that plant can spread. So I've got two examples here. One is poison hemlock on the left. It grows more in coastal California, and it has spread across most of the eastern US. But it does not grow very well in hot, humid areas like in the lower south, and it does not grow very well in the semi-arid Southwest from like West Texas to the deserts of California. In contrast to that, we have red brome, which is an invasive annual grass, and it does really well in warm to hot, arid conditions. So it's growing throughout most of the southwestern US, and it's found very few plants are found anywhere east of Texas across all the way to the eastern seaboard. It has spread as far as it can spread east, and it just can't tolerate growing in those more wet environments on the East Coast because it really does well with winter rain. It's a winter annual grass. So continuing with this idea that weeds and invasives are bad, they are spreading out of control and they have these bad effects. There have been thousands of experiments that have been conducted. I've conducted a couple of them, and not the thousands of experiments. I've just conducted a couple. But they almost all point to the same conclusion, that weeds are bad. There are few scientific studies on weeds that show that weeds have these positive benefits, despite what the internet might tell you. Most scientific studies show that weeds are bad. And I'll give you two examples. One from California is Cape ivy. Cape ivy grows generally along the coast. It is invasive in California, and it grows this kind of ivy vinish-like plant, and it smothers out plants that are growing under the canopy. So in this study, the scientists, it's not my study, scientists looked at the number of plant species that were growing where Cape ivy is present, and that's the black bars on the left graph, or the number of plant species growing where Cape ivy is absent with these shaded bars. And you can see in every case where Cape ivy is absent, there are more plant species growing, and especially there are more native plant species growing in the absence of Cape ivy, these shaded bars, than in the presence of Cape ivy, these black bars. And the mechanism for that, what they looked at in this study, is they looked at the seedlings of these plants. Because Cape ivy grows these big thick mats, in the right-hand graph, you can see that where Cape ivy present, again, the black bars, there are hardly any, almost zero native seedlings growing under the canopy of Cape ivy. And where Cape ivy is absent, you can see that there are many, many more native plant species growing. Now, there are even more non-native species growing where Cape ivy is absent, but still that native plant population is being massively reduced by that canopy of Cape ivy that's growing above head. So that is bad for native plants. In my second example here, I'm looking at yards and landscapes, and this comes from Doug Tallamy, who's written several excellent books on connecting native plants with our yards and with wildlife. And so in the study, he looked at the percent of non-native plants that are in a landscaping in a yard or like an apartments common area. And so on the horizontal axis on the left graph, we have the percentage of non-native plants. So if that landscape is dominated by non-native plants, the abundance of caterpillars, which is the solid line, decreases as the number of non-native plants increases. And the same thing is also happening with spiders, which is this dashed line here. So the takeaway message of this is that the more native plants you have on your landscape, the more insect wildlife you have on your landscape. And the more non-native plants you have, the less insects you have on your landscape. And many bird species eat insects, especially when they're feeding their young. So they looked at the survival of fledgling birds, so baby birds that are going to leave the nest in these same landscapes. And they found a really dramatic decline in the number of baby birds that survived as the percent of non-native plants increases in the landscape. And this is because those insects are not as abundant in the landscapes that are dominated by non-native plants. So that mama bird has a hard time finding food for her young. The harder she has to search, the less food she can give for her young, and the less young survive in the nest. So those baby birds sadly die. So again, this is quite a great example of how weeds work their way up the food chain to cause bad effects, from not providing food for insects to then those insects not being able to provide food for baby birds and having less baby birds in the landscape. So there are numerous negative effects of weeds in the landscape. I'm going to cover a couple of these in wildlands, but in general, they all fall into the bucket that weeds are bad, and weeds and invasive plants do not create good habitat. They do not create food resources, shelter, or other resources like nesting materials for native wildlife. And a really great way of thinking about this is if you were a pollinator, a butterfly or a bee, and you were searching for native lupins because you think that is the best and most tastiest food. If you go to a landscape that's dominated by non-native annual grasses and mustards, like on the right picture here, there's not a lupin to be found. If you are a butterfly that's host plant is lupins, you are not going to be able to survive in this area that is dominated by non-native grasses. So we talked about already how invasive plants reduce native plants. They can smother them, they grow taller than them, they make more seeds. They do this through all sorts of different ways, but the end result is there are less native plants in areas where we have invasive plants. On top of that, I kind of talked about this already. They reduce wildlife. I showed you the study that Doug Tallamy did, how when you have more non-native plants, you have less resources for insects, and that works its way up the food chain into, in his case, birds, but there's plenty of studies where they look at small mammals and working their way up into larger wildlife species as well. I also talked about how it reduces pollinators, and it makes sense. When you have an area that is dominated by native plants, you get all of these amazing wildflowers and native plants blooming. When you have a bunch of weed species growing, you have much less diversity and there's much less food resources for those pollinators. Invasive plants also reduce water infiltration into the soil. So a lot of the invasive plants in California are invasive annual grasses. And these invasive annual grasses have shallow root systems that are really, really dense near the soil surface. So when it rains, a lot of water is sucked up through those roots out of the top of the soil, and it doesn't get into the lower, deeper layers where a lot of native plants in California have really deep roots. This is a graph coming out of the Midwest, but the same principle holds for many plants in California. They're deeply rooted, much more deeply rooted than invasive grasses. So they're reducing that water infiltration into the soil and they're creating more runoff. Some invasive plants can block stream flow or alter the course of riparian areas. A great example of this is arundo or giant reed. It is this big, thick invasive grass. It can grow to be about 20 feet tall, and it's really thick and dense. And so if a flood comes along, arundo, giant reed, is blocking the flow of water, and it creates, it can dislodge and make flooding conditions worse, and it can also damage infrastructure as well. And so there's two satellite images here of two different river systems, and you can see all the red dots are where arundo is thriving. And so you can see really large patches, especially near the course of these rivers, where it can cause significant problems and very costly problems as well. Invasive plants also increase fire spread. So here's a picture of red brome. It's an invasive annual grass, and you can see that all of these dry grasses throughout this picture can easily carry a fire if there's an accidental ignition source, side of a road or something like that. So now we're starting to transition into the wildfire aspect of this talk. We talked about weeds, we talked about wildlands. Now we're getting into wildfires. I'm going to kind of highlight 3 different species of grasses, all in this group of grasses called the bromes. So there's a picture here of cheatgrass. It is spread across much of the Western US, and it is mostly found in the relatively cooler areas of California. It is a brome grass. We also have ripgut brome spread throughout most of the kind of middle-ish mesic areas of California along the coast in the foothills. And then we also have red brome, which I've shown some pictures of earlier, which is it grows inland, but it also does really well growing in the desert. So basically, no matter where you are in California, except in the driest deserts, you probably have one of these 3 invasive annual grass species nearby you. And again, they all make for poor habitat and they increase the fire risk. So I'm using the bromes as an example, but there are literally dozens of other invasive annual grasses that are in California and they're spreading, including oats, fescues, rye, barleys. There's a whole bunch of them. But what these invasive annual grasses do is that they grow taller than many of our native wildflowers. I talked about how wild oats does this. They also produce more biomass, more just plant material. And at the end of their growing season in the summer, that plant material is really dry and carries a fire really well, as you see in this middle picture here. There's a native shrub surrounded by these invasive grasses, ripgut brome. And if this ripgut brome were ever to catch fire, the fire would then move up and catch this chamise plant on fire. And you can see that there's relatively intact native habitat in the background of this picture on the right, and there's a lot of weedy annual grasses. So if a fire was to start in these invasive annual grasses, it could easily spread back into the intact habitat in the background. So why are these grasses such a problem? Well, as I mentioned earlier, many of the wildflowers in California and many of the native plants, they're just not that big. They're not as thick as these annual grasses. They don't grow as densely. They don't make as much fuel. And a lot of wildflowers tend to decay. So many of these plants are tolerant of fire. Fire is a naturally occurring process in California. But the wildflowers and our native plants tend in general to be less tolerant of frequent fires. These invasive annual grasses can burn every year, every other year, every 3 years, and their population will recover relatively quickly. Wildflowers and many of our native plants tend to need more years to get their populations to recover. So they're just competing in a different way after a fire than these invasive annual grasses. And because of that, those invasive annual grasses are spreading and thriving and can create more frequent fires. So here's a couple of pictures of how that's working. On the left, you can see that there's some poppies in this area with some wild oats. But these wild oats are growing really thick, dense, and tall. And there's just outcompeting these poppies. And so if you look more closely, you can see that there's a lot of poppy seeds, which are these tall, skinny pods, and the grasses are just really dominating in all of the spaces between these poppies. Most of what you're seeing here is invasive grasses, and there's relatively little biomass for the wildflowers. So on the long run, as these places burn, or even without fire, these invasive grasses are just outcompeting against these wildflowers. And even months after they've gone dormant, these invasive annual grasses are looking just fine, and they'll carry a fire really well. Here's ripgut, a picture taken in August, and you can see that there's a lot of brown, ready to ignite vegetation near the ground. And so because these grasses are growing in many parts of California, they are increasing the risk of roadside fires. And they're increasing it to the point where we can safely assume that many roadsides have a high risk of fire each and every year. And we know this because there's hundreds of thousands of roadside fires in California each year. Most of them are put out relatively quickly, but a few of them do turn into large conflagrations and large wildfires as well. So there's cars driving down nearly every single road, nearly every hour. Some of them have a flat tire, some of them catch fire, some of them are dragging chains. There's just sparks happening. It's oftentimes not on purpose, but when we mix roadsides with annual grasses, then we start getting a lot of these roadside fires. And so, as I said, this increases the likelihood of ignition, and these annual grasses start a laddering effect, or they create a ladder fuels. So imagine that we're driving around and we're in our Ferrari and we're flying down the road, and we get to a curve in the road and we crash on the side of the road, and there's all of these grasses on the side of the road, on the picture on the right, that we have now ignited accidentally, and they then catch fire to the medium-sized shrubs, which then catches fire on the larger shrubs, which catches fire on the larger trees. And that kind of creates this laddering of fuels, starting from the side of the road with annual grasses. So here's a picture of a roadside in Southern California, where we can see that the mowing has done a good job of keeping the medium-sized shrubs off the side of the road. However, there is a large contingent of invasive annual grasses and mustards as well that can quite easily catch fire if a car accidentally has a problem and moves off to the side of the road and emits some sparks. Those grasses are going to catch fire, and then they're going to move out into the medium-sized shrubs, and they're going to move up to the larger shrubs. And soon enough, it's going to, if the wind's blowing the right way, it's going to move a fire out into the hillsides out there, and now we have a wildfire. A well-maintained roadside will look like this, where there's a lot of bare ground on the side of the road, and the weeds are much farther away, usually 8 to 12 feet off the side of the road. So if there is any sparks or anything, they're likely to extinguish in the dirt because the dirt's not going to burn. There's no invasive annual grasses there, and we don't have as high of a wildfire risk. So because of this grass, the grasses that are abundant on the side of the roads, roadside managers and many roadside management agencies have been increasing and improving their roadside vegetation management programs to reduce these weedy, grassy fuel loads on the side of the road to help protect our communities. And this is not an easy task. For example, Caltrans manages 15,000 miles of roads. And that is only 10% of the roads in California. California has over 150,000 miles of publicly maintained roadsides. And many of these invasive grasses come in year after year, and they are here to stay. So it is not a task that you can do one time and walk away from for the next several years. It takes continuous management to keep these roadsides fuel reduced. And just because I'm highlighting how weeds cause fires on roadsides, there are many other causes of wildfires in California, including lightning and arson and power line failures and machinery failures, vehicle accidents, and so much more. This is just one way that weeds are causing wildfires in California. So if we can reduce these fine, flashy, invasive annual grasses that catch fire really quickly and reduce their populations, it can help to reduce the number of wildfires in California, especially the ones that start near roadside. This will not eliminate wildfires in California because California does have a naturally occurring fire regime, but it will help to reduce the increase in fires that we have in California. So wrapping this all up here, I talked about how weeds are unwanted or undesirable plants, and there are numerous weed species in California. There are several hundred weed species in California. And I talked about how invasive species are the bad guys. They're even worse than weeds, and they're crowding out native plants, and they're spreading aggressively in California. And I showed some examples of how they're spreading across North America. Many of these invasive species are poor habitat for wildlife. I showed a couple examples of that in wild areas, but also in our yards as well. And they reduce wildlife populations. There are some invasive plants, such as the invasive annual grasses, that increase the risk of wildfires. And I gave a really good example of how they do that on the sides of the roads. And we know that in California, fire is a natural part of the ecosystem, and invasive plants are making those fires worse. So with that, I think I have time for questions from the chat box. And there's my email address. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a great presentation.